The rain hammered against the windows of Marcus Chen's apartment like accusations he'd tried to forget for 3 years. He sat in the darkness, nursing cold coffee, when his phone lit up with a message from a number he thought he'd deleted 1,000 times, but had memorized down to the last digit. "I'm outside, please. I need you." His hands trembled as he read those 6 words, because the woman who had shattered him into pieces he'd barely managed to glue back together was standing in the storm below, and every instinct screamed at him to ignore her, to protect the fragile piece he'd built from the ruins she'd left behind. But Marcus had never been good at protecting himself from Elena Rodriguez, not when they met at Northwestern University, not during the 4 years they built a life together in Chicago, and apparently not now, as he found himself buzzing her into the building despite knowing it would probably destroy him all over again. If you believe in second chances, in the messy complexity of love and forgiveness, please hit that like button. Drop a comment about your own experiences with heartbreak and healing. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to this channel. Your support means everything, and it helps us bring you more real emotional stories that touch the soul. Marcus stood frozen at his door as Elena emerged from the stairwell, and what he saw made his breath catch in his throat for reasons entirely different than before. This wasn't the confident, radiant woman who had walked out of his life with her head held high, chasing dreams in New York City that apparently didn't include him. The Elena standing before him was a ghost of herself, soaked through to the bone, her designer clothes hanging off a frame that had lost at least 20 pounds, her once bright eyes now hollow and ringed with shadows that spoke of sleepless nights and tears that had run dry. She looked at him with an expression that mixed hope and desperation and shame in equal measures. And when she whispered his name, her voice cracked like glass under pressure. He let her in because despite everything, despite the nights he'd spent cursing her name and the mornings he'd woken up reaching for someone who wasn't there, he wasn't cruel enough to leave anyone standing in the rain looking that broken. Elena stood in his living room dripping water onto the hardwood floors they'd once picked out together, and she stared at the space that had been theirs, now rearranged and repainted, transformed into something that belonged only to him. Marcus watched her take in the changes with something like grief crossing her face, and he had to remind himself that she'd chosen this, that she'd been the one to pack her bags and announce that she couldn't breathe in the life they'd built, that she needed more, needed different, needed anything but what they had. That conversation 3 years ago was seared into his memory like a brand. Elena had gotten the job offer from a prestigious marketing firm in Manhattan, a dream opportunity that would triple her salary and put her on a path to the executive career she'd always imagined. Marcus had been genuinely happy for her at first, already planning how they'd make long-distance work, already researching jobs in New York for himself. But then she'd sat him down with tears in her eyes and explained that she needed to do this alone, that she'd been with him since she was 22 and had never really discovered who she was as an individual. That she loved him but felt suffocated by their comfortable routine, their predictable future. She'd said she needed space to grow, to explore, to become the person she was meant to be without the weight of their relationship holding her down. Marcus had begged her to reconsider, had offered to give her space while staying together, had suggested they pause rather than end things, but Elena had been adamant. She'd walked away with a suitcase and a certainty that had cut deeper than any knife, leaving him standing in their apartment wondering how someone could say they loved you while simultaneously deciding you weren't enough. The months that followed had been the darkest of his life, a blur of wondering what he'd done wrong, stalking her social media to see her thriving in the city, living the glamorous life she'd apparently always wanted, attending rooftop parties and gallery openings with people who looked far more exciting than a mid-level software engineer from Chicago could ever hope to be. Now she stood in front of him transformed again, but this time into something diminished rather than expanded. Marcus grabbed a towel and handed it to her, keeping his distance, keeping his heart carefully guarded behind walls he'd spent years constructing. Elena dried her face and hair mechanically, her movements slow and exhausted, and when she finally looked up at him, the words that came out weren't what he expected. She didn't apologize for leaving or beg him to take her back. Instead, she said she didn't know where else to go, that everyone she'd met in New York had turned out to be shallow and transactional, that her mother had passed away 2 months ago and she'd had no one to call, that the job she'd sacrificed everything for had chewed her up and spit her out when she'd been diagnosed with anxiety and depression and couldn't maintain their brutal pace anymore. The story poured out of her in fragments, pieces of a puzzle that revealed how spectacularly her grand adventure had imploded. The glamorous life Marcus had envied from afar had been a carefully curated illusion, a desperate performance to convince herself and everyone else that she'd made the right choice. The reality had been 90-hour work weeks, a boss who sexually harassed her, and an HR department that protected him instead of her. Friendships that evaporated the moment she was no longer useful for networking, and a city that had consumed her soul in exchange for a paycheck that barely covered her shoebox apartment in Queens. When her mother died suddenly of a heart attack, Elena had expected the community she'd built in New York to rally around her. But instead, she'd attended the funeral alone, flown back to an empty apartment, and realized with crushing clarity that she'd traded everything real for something hollow. Marcus listened with a conflict raging inside him that threatened to tear him apart. Part of him wanted to feel vindicated, to see her suffering as cosmic justice for the pain she'd caused him, but mostly he just felt sad, deeply and profoundly sad for both of them. She'd lost her mother, the woman who'd raised her alone after her father abandoned them, the woman who'd worked 2 jobs to put Elena through college and had always been her biggest cheerleader. And she'd had to face that loss without the support system she'd walked away from, including him, who had loved her mother almost as much as his own. The injustice of it all, the waste of it, settled over the room like a heavy fog. Elena finally broke down then, collapsing onto his couch with sobs that shook her entire body, and Marcus stood there battling every instinct he had. The old Marcus would have rushed to comfort her immediately, would have pulled her into his arms and promised everything would be okay, but that Marcus had died the day she left, and the new one was harder, more cautious, more aware of how love could be weaponized even when unintentional. Still, he wasn't made of stone, so he sat down at a careful distance and let her cry, occasionally handing her tissues from the box on the coffee table, waiting for the storm to pass. When she could speak again, Elena told him she wasn't asking him to take her back, wasn't expecting anything from him at all. She'd come because she needed to apologize, needed to tell him that she'd been wrong about everything, that the life she thought would make her happy had only shown her how. Happy she'd already been. She'd come to say that walking away from him was the biggest mistake of her life, not because New York hadn't worked out, but because she'd realized too late that growth doesn't require abandonment, that you can evolve and explore while still holding on to the people who love you, that she'd confused independence with isolation and ambition with self-destruction. She'd come to face the man she'd hurt and take accountability for the devastation she'd caused in pursuit of something that turned out to be smoke and mirrors. Marcus felt something crack inside him as he listened, some protective shell he'd built around his heart developing fissures. He told her about his own journey over the past 3 years, how he'd been promoted twice at work, how he'd started therapy to deal with abandonment issues he didn't even know he had, how he dated other women but could never quite connect with anyone because he was too busy comparing them to her and finding them wanting. He told her about the anger he'd worked through, the resentment he'd processed, the eventual acceptance he'd reached that sometimes people make choices that hurt us, and it doesn't mean they're villains, just human beings trying to navigate impossible decisions with incomplete information. They talked through the night as the storm outside finally cleared, leaving behind that clean, fresh smell that follows rain. Marcus made tea and ordered pizza, and they sat at opposite ends of his couch sharing a meal like civilized strangers rather than former lovers, maintaining boundaries even as the conversation grew more intimate. Elena asked about his life now with genuine interest, and he found himself being honest in ways he couldn't be with anyone else, admitting that he'd built a good life but a lonely one, that success felt hollow when you had no one to share it with, that he'd armored himself so thoroughly against being hurt again that he'd also armored himself against being truly happy. As dawn broke over Chicago, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Elena stood to leave. She looked at Marcus with eyes that held a question she was too afraid to ask out loud, and he looked back at her with an answer he wasn't sure he was ready to give. The truth was complicated, messy, painful. He still loved her, had never really stopped loving her despite his best efforts, but he also remembered the devastation she'd caused, and knew that loving someone and trusting them were two entirely different things. She'd broken something between them that couldn't be fixed with apologies and rain-soaked reconciliations. But maybe, just maybe, they could build something new from the pieces. Something different but equally valuable. Marcus walked her to the door, and before she left, he did something that surprised both of them. He asked her to stay in Chicago for a while, to get her bearings, to heal from everything she'd been through. He offered to help her find a therapist and a job, to introduce her to his network, to be her friend if nothing else, because despite everything, he couldn't stand the thought of her facing the aftermath of her mother's death alone. Elena looked at him with wonder and gratitude, and something that might have been love, or might have been hope, or might have been both, and she nodded through fresh tears. If this story touched your heart, if it made you think about forgiveness, second chances, or the complexity of love and loss, please do me a huge favor. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear this message, drop a comment below telling me your thoughts, and subscribe so you never miss another story. Your engagement truly matters and helps this content reach people who need it most. Before we finish, I want to ask you something special. In the comments, write just one word that describes how this story made you feel. I'll be reading every single one. They didn't get back together that day, or that month, or even that year. Instead, they did something harder and braver. They became friends again, slowly and carefully, learning each other as new people rather than trying to resurrect who they'd been before. Elena got therapy, found a job at a smaller company with better values, and started rebuilding her life in the city she'd once been so desperate to escape. Marcus continued his own healing journey, learning to trust again, learning that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, learning that sometimes the greatest love is choosing someone's well-being over your own comfort. 2 years later, they went to dinner to commemorate the anniversary of that rainy night, and somewhere between the appetizers and dessert, Marcus reached across the table and took Elena's hand. They'd both changed, both grown, both learned lessons that couldn't have been taught any other way. And while the path they'd walked to get there had been painful beyond measure, it had also been necessary. Sometimes people need to break completely before they can heal properly, need to lose everything before they understand what truly matters, need to walk away before they can really choose to stay. Their story didn't have a perfect ending tied up with a neat bow, but it had something better. It had truth and growth, and two people who'd learned that love isn't about never making mistakes. It's about what you do after the mistakes have been made, how you rebuild, how you choose each other not just once in a moment of passion, but over and over again in the quiet, unglamorous work of showing up and doing better.